Thank you all so much for coming out. So this is the Department of Philosophy's annual Dunbar Lecture. The Dunbar Lecture was set up years and years ago by a Millsaps graduate, Jack Dunbar, who had come here and was very, very strongly and favorably affected by his experiences in the philosophy classes, particularly with a professor named Robert Bergmark. And so he set up this lecture series in honor of Robert Bergmark. And so unfortunately Jack has passed away, but we're still so grateful for what he did, and he always emphasized that he wanted ideas that would really make people think. And so we strive to do that. So I don't know if there's anyone from the Dunbar family here tonight, but we always like to thank them. It has really been a gift in a lot of ways. So tonight I'm honored to bring to you our speaker, Peter Boghossian. He's a very interesting person. He got his doctorate in the philosophy of education and worked for a while in prisons, and I suppose still works to some extent, using the Socratic method to help prisoners think critically and use this to apply to their own lives, to be able to change their lives. And he taught at Portland State University for a while. And if you've seen anything about him on the posters or online, you know that had complications of its own. And as a result, he's become a really creative critic of the university system and what he thinks has gone astray, how the university system in some ways has gone astray from its primary mission. So he had resigned from Portland State and became sort of an on-the-street philosopher. And sort of one of the things he does is actually street epistemology. You may have seen some of his videos, where he engages people in conversations about their positions and what kind of evidence they have for their positions, how to articulate their positions right there, literally on the street. And it's a very interesting and creative way that he does these kinds of things. He also has a book out. He has several left, but the book we have tonight for sale, if you're interested, is How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide. And it is all about how to have calm, productive, useful conversations about controversial issues in a world in which we're so taught by the media not to do that, but rather just to flamethrow. So we appreciate the bringing to culture a way to talk about this, which is exactly what the university system should be doing. So I'm going to let him do whatever he wants to tonight. You're here to hear him. But I want to thank you for coming, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Boghossian.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation. And I give quite a few speeches, and never before, ever, has the president of a university ever come over and introduced himself to me. And I'm dead serious about it. It's the first time all around the world that's ever happened to me. I moved out of Portland fairly recently, but my daughter lives in Portland. I travel a lot for work, so I go back fairly frequently to see her and check in. And the other day I was in Portland, and I suffer from, as I was telling the audio guy, I suffer from tinnitus in my left ear, so I have a constant ringing and buzzing. So I carry my headphones around with me, and I'm always sticking my headphones in. That's why when I sit, I have to sit on one side of the table. So I had my headphones in, and I was at dinner, and a young man came over to me, and it takes something to come over to someone when they're clearly involved and on their headphones. And he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, Peter, right? Peter. And I said, yep, Peter. And he said, oh, I was your student, I don't know, I can't remember exactly what he said, X number of years ago. And I said, oh, great. How are you doing? And he said, terrible. And I said, terrible. Well, and I pulled up a chair and I said, well, what's going on? And it was a very intense conversation. He told me, he confided in me with some pretty serious problems that he was having in his life. And after I listened for a while, I said to him, well, do you have anybody to talk to? And what I meant by that was, do you have somebody you can seek for professional help, a counselor? And he said to me, no, I've lost all my friends. No, I've lost all my friends. And I have to say that that hasn't wholly resonated with me, but it resonated with me because I, too, have lost a tremendous number of friends in the last 5 years. I've lost people who have been in my home, people I love, people who have loved me, and I've lost them over what I consider to be absolutely idiotic reasons. The culture war. Specifically, one view that I have that children under 18 should not be allowed to transition. So I'm going to talk about that. So Johann Hari is an English author, and I had the pleasure of having dinner with him, and he wrote a wonderful book, Lost Connections. And in that book, he traces, it's a fascinating book, Chasing the Scream. All of his work is excellent. He's a truly remarkable writer. But he traces the lost connections that we've had, and the lost friendships, and the breakup of friendships. And right now, 54% of Americans say that they don't have anyone in their life, at least sometimes, who they can go to, who they can trust. 2 in 5 Americans say, these are statistics from Lost Connections, 2 in 5 Americans say they don't feel they have relationships that are meaningful, and they feel isolated in their life. If you really parse out that data, what's particularly interesting is that curve has exacerbated in the last 10 years, more or less when the culture war hit. And if you really take a look at that, it's among certain age cohorts, certain groups of individuals. So what I want to do tonight is I want to talk about something that literally that I've never heard anybody talk about in the culture war, in the large-scale ideological capture of our institutions, our academic institutions by, you can call it wokeism, Wesley Yang calls it the successor ideology, Majit Nawaz calls it regressive leftism, Helen Pluckrose calls it critical social justice, you can call it wokeism, it goes by any name, any one of a number of names, but the idea is that the ideology that is metastasized through our systems. I'm going to talk about how that affects our friendship, and I'm going to go over certain core ideas that are, for lack of a better term, secular blasphemies. If I have time, I'm going to do something that Jordan Peterson does that I like quite a bit. I'm going to think through a problem in real time that I don't have the answer to. It's something I've been thinking about, and it's a kind of intellectual vulnerability where I'll put my thinking on display as choppy and sloppy as it will. And then I want to conclude by talking about things that we can do to help reinvigorate our relationships and things that we can do to recapture the friendships we've lost. Okay. All right. So what do I have, an hour? Okay. Okay. So let's take a look at some basic ideas that some basic ideas that are considered more or less sacrosanct. The first idea is probably the most idiotic of them all. It comes from Robin DiAngelo, the uber best-selling author of White Fragility. This is a remarkable text. I don't necessarily recommend reading it. Usually when you talk about the older philosophers, the postmodernists, where much of this stuff has come from, I always recommend reading that. But there's a new crop of authors I don't think falls into that category, and Robin DiAngelo is one of them. So the claim is that your denial of racism is evidence of your racism. Your denial, so if someone says, if you're a racist and you say, no, I'm not a racist, that is somehow evidence of the fact that you're a racist. My friend Florence Reed from Unheard says that we live in a uniquely stupid age, and I think that this is the paradigmatic example of that. That doesn't work with literally anything else. It doesn't work with witches. If I accuse you of being a rhinoceros, and you say, no, I am not a rhinoceros, my response to you shouldn't be, that proves that you're a rhinoceros, right? So there is something uniquely idiotic about that idea that has gained wide-scale traction in the culture. Okay. That makes it extraordinarily difficult to have a relationship with someone, particularly if it's people of a different race, because somebody can always accuse someone of being a racist, and there's no response to that. There's nothing you can do about that. So part of the seed of the ideology is that racism is the ordinary, everyday state of affairs. So the role of the person trained in this, critical consciousness, critical social justice, is to develop the tools to uncover racism. So I'll give you a quick example. This comes from Cynical Theories, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's book. By the way, just parenthetical, that book sold almost 500,000 copies, and it was left off the New York Times bestseller list. Same reason that Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life was also left off the New York Times bestseller list. Clearly, by every metric, it should have hit the New York Times bestseller list. Okay. That parenthetical made me lose my train of thought. What was I talking about? Okay. So so you walk into a store. The exact same time that two people walk into a store, a white person walks into a store and a black person walks into a store, and there's a clerk. Well, who does the clerk wait on first? Well, who does the clerk help first? Well, this is your brain on critical social justice. If the store clerk, independent of their race, helps the white person, that's because they have white privilege. If the store clerk helps the black person, that's because they don't want them to steal something, so they want to get them out of the store. So remember, racism is the ordinary, everyday state of affairs. And if you bring that up to somebody and they say, no, I just randomly picked the person that had nothing to do with race, the white person, black person, they say, that's an example of white fragility, your failure to admit that you're racist. Okay, so that's one thing in a suite of propositions that I'm going to talk about, white fragility. And again, the reason, connecting that to friendship, the reason that that's so difficult to become friends with someone is because there's literally no way out of it. It's also called a Kafka trap. There's just nothing you can say to it because your guilt is already assumed right from the beginning. It's like the Salem witch trials. We're going to drown you. We're going to subject you to right to drowning, and if you drown, then you're not a witch, so you're good to go. But if you don't drown, then you're in trouble. So, given that there are no witches, needless to say, everybody drowned. Okay, let's take a look at something else again by the uber best-selling author Ibram X. Kendi. So there's so much to pick from Kendi; it's really difficult to be judicious. But let's just take a few of his ideas. Oh, and I just want to say very, very clearly, I published a piece in the New Statesman, I don't know, like a month ago or something. Yes, it is true that Kendi has just been at his BU Center accused of some pretty horrible things, and I don't know if he's innocent or guilty, but I don't think that that should bear any bearing whatsoever on his anti-racist doctrine. You cannot tie an idea that someone has, it could be an incredibly good idea, to whatever personal shortcomings or financial mismanagement one has. You have to look at the ideas on the basis of the merit of those ideas, independently of the people who offered those ideas. So let's take a look at some of Kendi's ideas. Again, this comes from Stamped from the Beginning, an extraordinary book for a number of reasons. That book I actually would recommend reading, unlike White Fragility. Okay. So let's take a look at some things that Kendi believes. One thing that Kendi believes is that it's a form of equity. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. So there's a discriminatory element built into a system. And the idea of the system is to remediate those disparities. So I'll group that, I'll bracket that with another idea that Kendi has that's fascinating. Kendi believes that every disparity in outcome, you really got to think about this, every disparity in outcome is due to systems. I'm going to repeat that because I know if someone's sitting in here and they're not familiar with this and they just heard what I said, it's going to be so absurd that they probably thought that they misheard. You did not mishear. Every disparity in outcomes is due to a system. For example, SAT scores, which I'm going to talk about later on. The disparity between, for example, cold climate Asians and African Americans, or Ashkenazi Jews and white people. That has to be something inherent in the system, inherently discriminatory in the system, that prejudices whatever it is that it ostensibly prejudices. Okay, let's take a look at this. Every disparity in outcome has to be due to systems. Well, why can't it be due to culture? We know Amy Chu, the Tiger Mom, has some really interesting stuff on this. The number of hours that Asians, cold climate Asians study is far exceeding everyone except actually for Ashkenazi Jews. We know that the data is clear for that. We know if you look at the study patterns and the breakdowns that we know that the number of hours correlated to study is a direct manifestation of grades. Not perfectly manifest, but more or less manifest. So you have that idea. You also have the idea that nobody wants to talk about, that there are potential genetic differences, not in race, but in people whose ancestors were subject to certain evolutionary pressures. They developed different cognitive, different physical abilities. Nobody wants to go there, so we can toss that one out. So you only have three explanations for those disparities. Why should ruling out the idea that some people study more, why can't we rule out a causal cultural explanation for why Asians do better, cold climate Asians do better on standardized tests? That was not rhetorical, I'm just kind of throwing that out. But if you believe in the idea that the system is somehow at fault, the system is responsible for every disparity, then you have to do a tremendous amount of mental gymnastics to create the conditions by which those disparities would be causally responsible by the system. And we know that's just not true. I think I mentioned at dinner tonight, you can just look at what food preferences people have. What food preferences people have could not possibly be someone's Armenian, my dad's Armenian, he used to eat a lot of Armenian food. That could not possibly be due to system, it's due to the culture, it's due to how he was raised. He listened to Armenian music. I grew up with it, I truly despised it, but he listened to it all the time. Every Sunday we'd have to go to church and I'd listen to it, and it was just a type of torment I can't even possibly convey to you. But we know that those things are not system-based. You can look at individual factors. Food preferences is probably the best way to think about that. Okay. And the way that affects friendships is, well, I'm going to bracket that, and I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to let you think about how that's going to affect friendships. So just remember, there are not many tools in the arsenal people have who believe these propositions. There are just not many. Bigot, racist, homophobe, Nazi. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. And then those words are used as weapons to weaponize whatever it is, any kind of a question. In academia, I don't know how it is here in Millsaps, but you also have institutional mechanisms to silence dissent and to silence questioning. I was told when I asked about the evidence for trigger warnings, I was told that asking for evidence for providing a trigger warning was a microaggression. You should always be able to ask for evidence in an academic environment, particularly with regard to whatever policy is being implemented. Evidence. The evidence should be right up there with truth. That's how you calibrate your beliefs, to the evidence. So, by the way, there's a paper, I think it's a 2017, Scott Lilienfeld. It was Microaggressions, Strong Claims, Inadequate Evidence. Okay, so I didn't want to necessarily touch this one, but I'm going to touch this one. This is the most incendiary of all topics. You motivated me when you said we can talk about controversial things. This is the most incendiary of all topics. And likely, fortunately, everybody's calm here. And amazingly, there are no police here. Usually I have like people in big body shields. This is the trans issue. This is the trans issue. So, as is an obligatory statement, every time I do these, let me be crystal clear about what my beliefs are. Anybody should be able to borrow a term from gender theorist Judith Butler. Anybody should be able to present in any gender they want without fear of discrimination or harassment, or have any sexual orientation they want, providing it's with consenting adults, without any form of harassment or discrimination whatsoever. Okay, with that being said, let's take a look at some of the claims. It is a uniquely perilous time. We have large groups of people institutionalized by bias response teams. Do you have a bias response team here? So that's good. So bias response teams are wings of university architecture, entire wings that you can report an incidence of bias, which can be a thought crime if you think somebody else thinks something. It's a great article by Julian Melcher in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. At the time, there were 230 bias response teams. That went up, and it's slowly declining now. Those bypass traditional academic and university structures and are reported right to the president, and often there's a police report filed against you from the bias response team. You can also file bias responses against people anonymously. So you can say, this person said this, you don't have to put your name in. It's a way to weaponize existing structures in universities to silence dissent and to keep people quiet. So the trans issue is a rather remarkable issue. I have some statistics that are fascinating to me about the trans issue. Do you remember when Judge Jackson went to the Supreme Court hearing and they asked her what a woman was? And she's totally baffled by that. Completely, no idea. You need specialty education, you need to be a biologist, how could I possibly know? Well, you know who knows what a woman is? Hamas knows what a woman is. We are moving in a situation now where we have large groups of people institutionalizing ideas in which they are pretending not to know things that literally everybody knows. Everybody knows what a woman is. Literally everybody. And if you don't know what a woman is, you're either lying about it or you're profoundly delusional. And again, with the caveat being that anybody can present as any gender they want. Anybody, once they're 18, you can get any kind of surgery you want. That's not what this is about. This is about a kind of relationship to other people that you have, that the university system, specifically the ideology which has taken over the universities, and I can't say here for this institution in particular, mediates the relationship between people. This is why this matters. Matters for two reasons, especially if you're younger. This matters for two fundamental reasons. The only way that you can develop an authentic relationship with somebody is if you say what you mean and they say what they mean. Because if she doesn't say what she means, then I'm only going by what she says. So I'll never really know her, I'll only know what she says. Similarly with me, you will only know what I say. And when you're told certain things that you have to think, it's a version of cognitive liberty. When you're told that you have to think certain things, have certain beliefs, which pretty much most people know aren't true, that interferes with any kind of authentic friendship you want to have. You cannot possibly have a friendship in which you don't know who the other person is because they're just parroting whatever the dominant moral orthodoxy is, whatever is morally fashionable. But here's the other reason. And it gets back to what that young man said to me about not having friends. Aristotle in the Ethics says that there are different types of friends. We can learn a lot from the Greeks and friendship, particularly Aristotle, that there are different types of friends. One type of friend is the kind of friend that, you like to bowl, she likes to bowl. You like some hobby, fishing, and I like to go fishing. I don't know the first thing about fishing. So let me tell you something I know about, jiu-jitsu. Anybody do jiu-jitsu in here? Nobody? Okay, you're all dead to me. You like science fiction, I like science fiction. We all have common interests that we share. Okay, that's one level of friendship. The next level of friendship is good conversation. You like to have good conversation. I like to have good conversation. The Greeks often had wine with their conversation. That's optional, but we sit down, we talk about whatever it is, and we share that in the process of enriching our lives. I've been thinking about this next thing for a quarter century now. The highest form of friendship is between two virtuous people. I'm going to repeat that because that's so important. The highest form of friendship is between two virtuous people. What does Aristotle mean by a virtuous person? Well, it's interesting. It's very different in a lot of senses from Christianity, what we consider a Christian. Christians are, humble about things. The Aristotelian gentleman was not humble about, and he boasted about things that he was good at. But it's to speak, the Greeks have a word for it, parrhesia, to speak truth in the face of danger. If your friend is doing something that you don't like, to tell your friend. And it's done within the context of that friendship. If your friend is saying something, maybe it's something somewhat benign, like they're hurting your feelings, or maybe your friend has a belief that you don't like. Two virtuous people, withholding your judgment from having an honest conversation with somebody when they ask you what you think about something is not an act of kindness. It's an act of self-sabotage. You're effectively killing your opportunity to have an honest relationship with someone. And the moment you do that, you lose your connections with other people. That's the Johann Hari book, Lost Connections. You lose your connections. And a lot of the danger of the ideology is that it forwards certain worldviews that tells people this is what you have to think. This is what you have to believe. I have, maybe I'll overshare, but I have 2 kids. They're both gays. I have friends, people I know in my life, who don't think gay people should be able to get married. That's not a deal breaker for me. Sometimes maybe that's a deal breaker for you. I don't know. Different people have deal breakers. It's not a deal breaker for me. Julie Beck has a wonderful piece on friendship in The Atlantic, which she does a series. She offers 6 pieces of advice for people to maintain friendships. But one of those pieces of advice is grace. To show your friend some grace, to show your friend some forgiveness. And in my book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, I think one of the most important things in the whole book is you can let friends be wrong. We have an academic environment now, writ large, that doesn't let people be wrong. It tells very specific ideas about very specific moral propositions and asks you to come to very specific moral conclusions. That's not the purpose of the university. That's not how we should be thinking about the problem. Okay. So all of these orthodoxies prevent the emergence of any authentic friendship. And when you don't have authentic friendships, again, to mention Johann Hari, he argues that the opposite of alcoholism and drug addiction is not sobriety. It's lost connections. It's lack of community. We underestimate that role in our lives. So I'm going to do something a little different now. I'm going to think through a problem. I have some statistics that I came across. I don't know what the answer to this is. I'm going to think through it out loud. If Harvard admitted students from only the top 10% of its applicant pool, this is what the applications would look like if they were race blind. Ashkenazi Jews, interestingly enough, are not on here. But Asians would move from 25% of the matriculating class to 52%. I rounded these numbers up or down by 0.5, I rounded it up. Whites would drop, so that's a pretty significant jump for Asians, from 25% to 52%. Whites would lose a little bit, from 38% to 36%. That underscores the idea that this is some kind of a white supremacy. Oh, and by the way, that's the single best example of systemic racism I've ever found. There is actually systemic racism, and it's against Asians, and it's against Asians at elite schools, and Harvard's lost a lawsuit, and we know it's true. It's demonstrably true. So next time someone tells you there's no systemic racism against people of a different race, that's blatantly false. It's demonstrably false. Hispanics would go from 15% to 3%. But what's really interesting about this is African Americans would go from 16%, I think it's like 15.9, but I rounded it to 16, to 0.9, to under 1% of the top 10% of people matriculating into Harvard. Okay, so I want to think through this idea. So I think the best way to think about these problems, to remove any, it's very difficult to do this entirely, but to remove any kind of ideology from it, is to ask yourself some pretty basic questions. The first thing when I read that statistic, my first thought was, well, what's the problem with Asians being 52% of the matriculating class of our elite institutions? Anybody want to take a guess? Anybody want to throw out an idea? Or you can save it for the Q&A. We can talk about it then. Okay, so how would one go about thinking about this problem? Here's a suggestion that I have for a way to think about if you're ever caught in a moral problem, a moral conundrum. I've probably released, 200, 300 videos around this. I go all around the world and I ask people questions that literally nobody wants to talk about. And I have a bunch of lines: strongly agree, agree, slightly agree, neutral, and then the other side. And they'll ask a question, and then they'll go to, we have mats, they'll go to a mat to indicate their confidence. It's just a Likert scale, basically. And you can see the physical manifestation of belief change as you ask targeted Socratic questions to people. So one of the most important questions you can ever ask in your moral life is, what kind of life ought I to lead? One of the most important questions you can ever ask in your intellectual life, in your belief life, and the Greeks call it doxa, in your doxastic life, is how could I be wrong about that? It's a question almost nobody asks themselves. And here's the problem, and I'm going to relate that to this in a second. When I looked at that data, my first thought was, well, what's the problem with Asian Americans comprising 52% of the graduating class, or the matriculating, and assuming, I don't know if actually they all graduate, but assuming graduated class. My first thought was this could create a two-tier society. You'd have cold climate Asians and Ashkenazi Jews, and you'd basically have everybody else. Again, Ashkenazi Jews aren't in there, but I can assure you that they're overrepresented as more than 2% of the population. My guess is that'd be 17, 18%, but I don't have the number off the top of my head. Well, what's the problem with not having proportional representation? In other words, we have a certain percentage of minorities, and we want to mirror that percentage of minorities in the elite institutions. Well, a few things are a problem. So this is an argument by analogy, and I'm thinking this through. What would be the problem if somebody said, women have been proportionately historically underrepresented on boards, so we're going to make a law saying 50% of all boards are now comprised of women? The problem that I see with that is that it would undermine trust that the board could discharge its mission, because the people on that board wouldn't necessarily be the most qualified for the position. So it would cause a kind of legitimacy crisis among the board. Okay. So again, these are the ways that I would think through the problem. I'd think analogously. And then I would ask myself this question: how could I be wrong about the fact that I personally do not think there's a problem with 52% of Asians graduating from elite institutions? Like, what would it take for me? Remember the math thing that I laid out, strongly agree? I think my belief on that would be agree. What would it take me to move one space to the right and one space to the left? In other words, what would it take me to say, okay, so I think that's not a problem, but what would it take me to slightly agree instead of agree? So here's the problem. So you could actually create an entire academic system. We're trying to do this at the University of Austin. You can create almost an entire academic system built on Popper's notion of falsification. He was the Austrian English philosopher of science. So in other words, when you ask somebody a question and they give you reasons, they artificially inflate the confidence that the thing they're telling you is true. But if you say to them, what would it take to change your mind? Very few people are ever asked that question. So it creates a little wedge, a little space for them to think. So in my case, what would it take me to move one line to the left? I'd have to be assured that the people who, like African Americans, Hispanic Americans, whites, I'd have to be assured that those in the bottom of the pyramid would have some kind of opportunity to go to the top. I'd have to have some kind of way of knowing that. But what would it take me to move one line to the right to slightly agree? Boy, I don't know. I really have to think about that. I'm just thinking this. I'm doing this on the fly here. I'd probably need to. What would it take me to think that? I really don't know. And I'm actually going to pay myself a compliment. You know, I don't know is a great answer to any question. Because every time you say I don't know, then you don't pretend to know things you don't know. Yeah, what would it take you?
Well, the original hypothesis is predicated on the theory that you can determine what a top student is. And maybe
Yeah, there are metrics for that. Like SAT scores and grades are the top two metrics.
What if those don't align with your value proposition?
That's excellent. If they don't align with your value proposition, then you should say in your mission statement what your values are. Our values are not to get the best and the brightest. Our values are proportional representation. I have no problem with that. Then I would have zero problem with that, because that would be a kind of honesty. So we're no longer the best institution. We have another goal. It's not to find truth. It's not to prepare citizens for civic responsibility. It's not to give people jobs. It's to assure proportional representation. If you do that, there's much less likelihood of a legitimacy crisis in the institution, because people will trust the institution because you're doing exactly what you're saying you're going to do. You're going to get 15% African Americans in. You're saying you're going to get 50. No problem. I have no problem with that. But that's not what they're doing. They're not being honest. They're lying.
What if their definition of the best is different than your definition of the best?
Well, then they should articulate that clearly. So that's a Mott and Bailey. Like, don't hide the ball. Be honest about what you're doing. Be honest about the mission of your institution. You shouldn't have to lie. You should be completely transparent in your institution. Now, you could make the argument that they're a private institution. They don't take federal money, so they can do anything they want. That's fine. No, I'm totally open to that argument. But specifically, certainly with public institutions, we have to have some kind of transparency and accountability in our public institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand. So your argument sounds very out of history. It seems like if we just take everything as it is now and apply it. And I'm curious because you talked about outcomes being separate from society expectations, and how do we explain the differences in outcomes? Aren't outcomes inherently dependent on societal expectations and the society that they're present in? Like how we define what a high achieving student is, isn't that part of society?
So you're saying the criteria for admissions are themselves arbitrary and thus subject to capricious cultural factors?
So yeah, you're talking about a specific outcome, like going to Harvard is this thing to be achieving. Isn't that dependent on the society that determines the values of that outcome?
Yeah, I agree. I told my daughter's going to college. I told her, don't go to college, be an electrician.
Sure.
I don't trust university as one iota. I think they're doing the opposite of what they should be doing. But yeah, so there are always values inherent in those. So it could be that you decide for Harvard that what you're going to do is you're going to get the people who can ski the fastest. That's your new entry criteria. Okay, well, that would discriminate against poor people writ large. But if that's what you want to do, that's fine. You should just say our goal is to get people who can ski downhill. I don't know anything about skiing. I just randomly made that up. But, however many feet per second or whatever, by whatever metric people judge successful skiing. I have no idea. All right. So I wasn't planning on doing Q&A, but let's go for it.
You're much more interesting when you talk to people.
Okay, well, I'll do that. I wanted to connect it to the friendship thing, but okay, yeah.
So if you're not keen on universities for young people to go, where are they supposed to go to get the tools that you would typically expect to achieve at university now, other than
That's a great
University
question.
of Boston or Jordan Peterson's online and attempt developing?
This is a hard pill to swallow, what I'm about to say. It's a hard pill to swallow, but I want you to just really think about this for a second. I'm kind of reminded of those people who like they love football and they're always talking about football. I don't know anything about football, but I do know about MMA. I love MMA. I can watch that stuff all day. I love it. And in fact, I do watch it with my free time. Think about it like this. If you engage in a process that takes you away from reality, you would be far better off looking at a wall than engaging in a for example, if you're learning to fight and you're taught to fight like this, someone's going to give you a righteous beatdown, right? Because you have to keep your hands above your head and you have to move when someone comes in to hit you. I would argue in many cases that the ideology and the specific propositions that are being forwarded by institutions right now, academic institutions, and I'll give you one right now. Colleges of education are predicated on Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. You teach to liberate. We've taught an entire generation of people now that the role of education is to remediate oppression and liberate people as opposed to truth. And we're now down this crazy Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole where we've demeaned the whole concept of truth for kind of, so the bottom line answer to that is, my argument to you would be it's far better to do nothing than to learn something that's wrong or mistaken. And I've seen that in the curricula that my daughter brings home from school. It's basically purely ideological. If I could give you one example of that, gentrification. They're hell-bent against any kind of gentrification whatsoever, which is fine. I have no problem with that. But what you should do in those situations is you should offer the other side of the argument, the best side of the argument for why gentrification is good. And you should give people the tools to enable them to make discerning judgments about that. So the key isn't that you have to withhold judgment, for example, about what a woman is, but we need to teach people how to make better discerning moral judgments, particularly as it applies to the moral domain. That would be my argument. So I guess since we're doing the Q&A. Yeah, hi. I love tough questions. People who disagree with me, you go first in the front of the line.
I have a counter proposal for you.
Please.
I would make the argument that education is meant to be a community engagement. Because anytime one side of an argument is presented, the other side should be, and it's hard for a single entity to do that by themselves.
Yeah, I agree. It's a community.
So rather than doing nothing, wouldn't it be better for our young people, who then would be left to their own devices to discern whatever truth comes from within themselves, to be exposed to more voices where they have an opportunity to decipher the truth?
You tell me, I'm going to give you my argument against it. You tell me if my reasoning is in error or not. And I will say, total honesty, I don't want to be wrong one more second than I have to be, so I'm totally willing to change my mind in real time on the spot. The problem is, what we spoke about, there's no corrective mechanism there. You have to have a way to correct, like, just because somebody feels something strongly about a fact, it doesn't make it true, unless it is in the realm of taste, like we talked about at dinner, unless it's in the realm of, like, I got a steak and potatoes tonight, but his thing looked kind of gross to me. I don't like catfish. So I'm infallible in terms of my own likes. I'm infallible in terms of music. I love Tool, and I can't stand some other bands. But so those things. But in terms of like empirical questions or right and wrong, I think we have an over-reliance on subjectivity, and there's a whole. So this is part of the problem. When people demean evidence for long enough, what they have to do is they have to fabricate their own epistemologies, like standpoint epistemology. And standpoint epistemology is a direct consequence of not valuing things that are true long enough. Questions? Since we're doing questions, I was going to tie it to friendship, but that's okay. Yeah, hey.
Yeah, when you were speaking towards the beginning, I think you kept mentioning the term like culture wars. Like, I think I know what you mean by that, but like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a fantastic question. So the last 10 years in the United States have been more or less consumed by a lot of things. So I'm going to trace it back a little bit farther than that. We went, and I think that this is bad, but we went from a time in which objectivity was king, right? So, kind of a God-centered universe, objective, everything, we know the truth, Like that's manifested in pedagogy, like behaviorism, what have you. And then postmodernism, I'm simplifying, but basically, postmodernism came along in the 70s, Derrida, Lyotard, Foucault, and they had ideas that kind of questioned truth, said there's no God's eye view, et cetera. And then from there, you got what Helen Pluckrose calls applied postmodernism. You apply the concepts from Derrida and Foucault. And then from there, you get the culture wars. So the culture wars is the application of certain postmodern principles. And I'll give you some examples of those. Fat studies. So fat studies is a great one. It's a great one because it's just so demonstrably idiotic. But if I told you that there was and then I'm going to answer your question specifically after more globally. If I told you that there was a journal called Fat Studies, what would you think it would do? What kind of stuff would be in the journal? Just take a guess.
Physical facts, like
A1Cs, how many carbohydrates should you eat? Like how much should you work out? What's a good weight for your height? That's not what it is now. It's kind of advocacy. So the culture wars were largely fueled, in my opinion, by academicians, professors, who have fabricated entire lines of literature and peer-reviewed studies that forward certain conclusions about fat people, certain conclusions about race, certain conclusions that, for example, sex is assigned at birth. Sex is not assigned at birth. If you say sex is assigned at birth, that's just like somebody randomly walks in and say, oh, she has a vagina, well, maybe we'll say she's a female, or that person's a female. No, I did a few great deep dives with biologists on this. I'm not a biologist. That's actually a legitimate use of not a biologist. So the culture wars are primarily coming from the universities. I covered some examples about racial disparities, forwarding certain moral conclusions about equity over equality. So it's a very large bucket of propositions dealing with race, gender, sexuality. That's the bottom line. But it has a very specific history. It comes from postmodernism and the application of postmodernism, and postmodernism as a rejection of this objectively black and white way of knowing the world. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I was sort of mostly like your usage of the term like war, because to me that's what it implies is like a war between like two or more parties. Maybe I'm reading too literally into that.
No, there is a war. There's a war between. No, you're right. You're right. There's a war between. Well, now it's a different war. Okay, so I'll give you a real quick explanation. So I published a piece about this in the American Mind a few years ago. So it went from, in Cultural 1.0, what you saw, it was primarily Christians versus atheists, right? So, and that, the very specific application of that culture war was whether or not we should, what role should the quote-unquote theory of evolution play in schools? And that was the large culture war. In Culture War 2.0, we have some fascinating things that have happened. Culture War 2.0, we have individuals who don't play by the rules of engagement. So the rules of engagement. So for example, I come in here and I give a talk. If this were Culture War 1.0, maybe not Millsaps because we're in Mississippi here, but if I were in Cultural 1.0, people would want to debate me, they'd maybe stage a protest, they'd maybe stage a counter lecture, but what they wouldn't do is bring in bullhorns. What they wouldn't do is accuse me of raping somebody. What they wouldn't do is report me to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for a Title IX violation. So that's one thing. The other thing is what's called the correspondence theory of truth. In Cultural 1.0, both atheists and Christians think that there's a truth of the world and it can be known. And for example, in evolution, it's manifest in that since the Scopes monkey trial, there's a truth to the world and it can be known. In Culture War 2.0, we moved to what I said to you from the standpoint of epistemology. We moved to subjective ways of knowing. So it's a war between different factions. But here's the mind blow about this whole thing. In Culture War 2.0, you have, this is so weird. This is like, when I figured this out, it totally blew my mind. You have woke Christians and woke atheists aligning, and you have anti-woke Christians and anti-woke atheists aligning. So most of my donors to my nonprofit, I'm I'm an atheist. I mean, people have called me a militant atheist. I don't know if that's true. I consider myself more of an infidel. But you have people, you have Christians and atheists. The woman who works in my nonprofit is an evangelical Christian. She knows I'm an atheist. I know she's a Christian. Everybody's happy because we have cognitive liberty. We live in America. Everybody can do what they want to do because we believe in the basic principles of the republic. We view the other side as wanting to tear down statues, as wanting to do things that are inimical to the flourishing of civil society. So that would be why it's a war. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, hey, hi.
Hey, I guess referencing Mississippi, I guess being in Mississippi, you kind of find that there's a lot of things that kind of need to be done. I guess a lot of opportunity to kind of, I guess, make your own, I guess, way, make your own out of it. I worry that having followed, I guess, like you, among others, about this whole like culture war thing over the years, that the big national sexy issues of the culture war, I feel like kind of, at what point does it kind of take away from like the reality boots on the ground of like getting things done? Because like thinking about Mississippi, a big issue in the governor's race was hospital closures, and it's like you try to harp on that, but it seems like a lot of what people want to talk to is like culture war stuff that, well, you were working in a prison. It's like, how much does all this culture war stuff affect people that you like work with who are just like the average kind of person? Like, how do you balance something like that?
That is a fantastic question. This is smart students. Okay, here's the answer to that. Here's how I would answer that question. In the list of things that one should be talking about, how do we morally triage, whether or not we should have men and women's sports, or whether or not we should address the fentanyl crisis, or the homeless crisis, or which are very closely related? I would argue that men and women's sports, while conspicuous and while egregiously idiotic, should not even play a remote concern it should be valued less than trying to figure out homelessness. It should be valued less than trying to figure out the fentanyl epidemic. We're $33 trillion in debt right now. 1/3 of the interest collected last year, 1/3 of the tax payment went just to pay the interest on our national debt. This is going to kill us. I'm telling you, this is going to kill us. And we have a lot of people, myself included, who are talking about, things that are largely in the culture war. I will say two things. One may be in my defense, that we're talking about ideas that are indispensable to the functioning of civil society. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. And myself and others, I'm not a conservative. I view myself as, I don't know if the axis of liberal and conservative is particularly helpful anymore, but I've never voted for a Republican in my life. But I do feel that the threats that we face now as a society are extraordinarily dangerous, and they're from very illiberal elements of the society, almost exclusively manifest on the far left, and they're attempting to undermine civility, participation in civil society, and democratic institutions. And the nucleation point of all of that is our academic universities. So that's one thing. I will change gears a little bit and say that I've been very disappointed recently in what I've seen the quote-unquote anti-woke space come in the culture war. It's becoming one large echo chamber where it's actually becoming a kind of Christian nationalism, where people want to forward very specific ideas as opposed to what it was originally for, is to foster civil and individual liberties for people, to foster basic constitutional guarantees. So I think that my primary motivation is the liberty aspect, and the conclusions that one comes to are again, just to use the trans one, no men and women's sports, no transitions. If there is racism in a system, we need to identify it and we need to fix it, but that doesn't license ripping down the whole system, right? We need to, if there's a statue, a Confederate statue, and you don't want it there, this is not kind of thug rule. You don't have license to go around and just destroy people's buildings. Where you approach the municipality or whatever it is, and there are democratic processes by which you can get the statue removed. This is not the Wild West where you don't like something, you just rip it down and start killing people. I mean, that's completely insane. But the fact that that has become itself a conservative proposition, it does not bode well for the society. You know, my parents are long dead, but if I told my father, if I went back, if I had a time machine, I said, listen, in 20 years, there are going to be people who are rioting in the city. Now, you don't actually know why they're rioting. They may be rioting for a good reason. They may be rioting for a bad reason. What do you think should happen to these people? My father would have looked at me like I had literally lost my mind. Like, what do you mean what should have happened to them? We arrest them. That's just what we do with people who riot. We arrest them. And we have a democratic process that we can fix or adjudicate it. We can solve the problem. But now, if you say that, particularly in Portland, you're considered some far-right maniac. Right? If a great example of this, I tweeted this out years ago, when you ask people who self-identify as liberals and people who self-identify as conservatives, how many unarmed black men were shot by police in 2017, 2018, 2019? I wrote the afterword for Matt Thornton's book, The Gift of Violence, where he talks about this. It's a wonderful book. If you ask people, anybody want to take a guess what that number is? Yeah, that's about right. It depends how you parse the data, because sometimes it's like when someone drives a car at an officer, they consider that to be unarmed. Like, so it depends, you know, it's like one of the things in the data was some guy was going after a cop with a toaster, and they considered that to be unarmed. So it depends on, but I'll give it to you, roughly 20. I mean, it's an order of magnitude would be 200. It's certainly closer to 20, but when you ask a lot of people, particularly on the left of the spectrum, they'll say, like, I asked my neighbor that question during the pandemic. She told me 22,500. Are you 22,000? Are you kidding me? That's like a Holocaust. 22,500? That's like, I mean, that is so divorced from reality. But anyway, that's the basic idea. I would love to not be talking about things, and I would actually love to get back to some of my academic work that nobody ever asked me about. They only asked me about culture war stuff, which I'm fine to talk about because I think it's important. But in the hierarchy of things, I don't think it's important at all. I think there are far more things. I mean, the Ukraine war, the national debt, Taiwan. I mean, the United States is going off the currency basket, Bitcoin. We could talk about any one of a number of things, and the stupidest among those is men and women's sports. Uniquely idiotic. Yeah, hi.
So there's recently a group of businesses, the last time I heard this was about 90 businesses, including Walmart and other, that were saying that they were just dropping college degree requirements from a lot of their jobs, including even upper management. Do you think that some of the obsession in the universities with political ideology and those kinds of things, is that, how much of that do you think is responsible for that?
100%
just how much?
Literally all of it.
Okay.
So if you look at data, and FIRE has some data on this. If you look at data, and I'm always amazed when I look at this data, slightly over 80%, I can't remember exactly, I think it's like 81% of conservatives don't trust the academic institutions. I was flabbergasted when I read that. I was completely flabbergasted. I mean, if they actually knew what went on, I would think it would be 100%. Like, I just could not believe the number was so low. But when you look at liberals, so people who self-identify as liberals, it's 60 to 70% trust the institutions. Only 30% don't trust the institution. So it's it's broadly along party lines. When you look at, when you name specific institutions, the number one Ivy people don't trust is Yale. And there's a great reason for that. There's a great reason for that. So there is a move afoot now if somebody has a degree from an elite institution to not hire them. Now, I will show all of my cards here and be very honest with everyone. I do not think that the universities are capable of saving, and I want to see them all utterly destroyed. And my friend Joshua Katz, former professor of classics at Princeton, wrote a wonderful piece, and I'm thinking about writing a rebuttal, about how we cannot destroy our institutions because these are our knowledge are engines of knowledge production, and we have to compete, we have to remain competitive in the world, specifically with the Chinese. But that gets back to what I said to you. There are two schools of thought on this. The first school of thought is the Chris Rufo, Ron DeSantis school, is you try to reform the existing system. And Chris is a good friend of mine, and I wish him luck, and he wishes me luck with what I'm trying to do. I hope he's successful, but here is something to think about. You have a choice, and the choice is very clear. If the choice is not 100% because there are cultural variables, but you either have offices of DEI or you have free speech. You cannot have both. They're mutually exclusive. I mean, the whole purpose of the Office of DEI is to squelch speech that people consider offensive. Yeah.
Institutions have become echo chambers now.
Correct.
It's not like you can instill a bunch of Peter Boghossians in all these universities to oppose what's there. So it kind of fits your point. How do you go backwards from there?
Yeah, so let me tell you what the solution is not. The solution to wide-scale, far-left ideological capture of our institutions is not another Hillsdale. It's not another Liberty. It's not another conservative institution. That will only polarize this country and make things worse. This is Pano Canoulis' point, who's the president of the University of Austin. The solution is an independent institution that has ideologically diverse faculty and gives people the tools to argue for and hear both sides of the issue. That's the solution to the problem. That's why I think that the lecture-based pedagogy is not the way to go in 2024. I think it should be either some kind of a dialectical pedagogy in which there's either kind of a Socratic thing or it's kind of a street epistemology thing, or debates are good. I'm not a big fan of debates, but they do help people clarify the issue. Better yet, fireside chats, conversations with giving people tools. I think you risk creating echo chambers every time now some things you need lectures, right? Like medicine are things you have to remember. But in the humanities, in the soft sciences in general, I think that we need to be more responsive. But the bottom line is, I want to see every academic institution in the country burn. Because I don't think that they're salvageable. Maybe not this one.
On that note, I'd like to come back to friendship and what you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. I'll just finish that last point, and that gets back to what I said to you before, that it's better to not learn something that's wrong. Let me give you a quick example of this. Who's a psychology major in here? Okay, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Okay, this is important. Okay, what year are you in?
Freshman.
What year are you in?
Junior.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Okay, so you're a psychology major. Have you heard about the replication crisis?
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay. So here's something that I'd like to rethink about. There's a replication crisis in psychology right now. 50%. 50%. Literally half of the papers cannot be replicated. I have gone literally around the world and spoken to audiences in almost every language you can think of, and I've asked psychology majors exactly like I've done with you, who's a psychology major, what year are you in, have you heard of the replication crisis? I've not had a single hand in years raise their hand. Now, what's the solution to that? Day one, intro to psychology, right in the syllabus. We're going to teach you the best available evidence. You need to know 50% of the studies in the entire corpus of literature cannot be replicated. We do not know which those are. But we're not going to teach you this as true. We're going to teach you this we're not even going to teach you this, if it were 95, we could teach it potentially as provisionally true. But we're going to teach this as pretty much of a dartboard throw. But the fact that that is not taught, to me, is indicative of another kind of crisis of legitimacy in the institutions. And if anybody doesn't believe me, please don't believe me. Just look it up for yourself. Replication crisis. Okay. Yeah. Hi. And then I'm going to get back to friendship.
It's not that I don't believe you, but I teach in the psych department, and
I don't want you to believe me.
She might not remember it, but we teach it in intro and also in our research methods.
No, she didn't have you.
Yeah.
She said maybe.
She hasn't had research methods yet. It's next semester.
Yeah. So she didn't have you.
Right, we talk about it, but we also talk about reasons why they can't be replicated, which is people change. And so a study from the 50s, why would it be replicated then?
So as long as that's made transparent to students, we're good to go. As long as we are not creating, yeah, right. As long as we're not extending the confidence in what we think we know beyond the warrant of the evidence, to go. All of our problems, a significant number of problems come when the confidence in our belief is extended beyond the warrant of the evidence. And we must always be on guard. That's why asking that question, what would it take for me to change my mind, is so unbelievably useful. It's like incredibly valuable. I would actually incorporate that into every class that I had. And you can do, if you watch the videos, you can do that for free. You just put people online. You don't even need tape. You just put a piece of tape, you find something and you ask them, you make a claim, you think this study is true? What would it take to change your mind? Boom, done. You don't even have to prepare. It's super easy. Okay, friendship. The other consequence of large-scale ideological capture and having things people want you to believe is when you can't know somebody for who they are, but for only what they say, they can never know you. And I would argue very sincerely that you cannot develop friendships of virtue. Not telling your friend something that it is not an act of kindness if your friend does something that you disagree with to not tell them. I mean, don't be a dick about it, tell them in a nice way, but there is something, what I have seen happen, and I've been in academia most of my life, there's something I've seen happening in the last few years that to me directly corresponds to what Johann Hari talks about in Lost Connections. And it directly corresponds to the fact that people aren't communicating across divides, they're not having that pro-socially modeled for them. They think that any slight deviation in a belief system means that this person is not merely a bad person, but they're an existential threat, they're my enemy. And so that those behaviors aren't modeled, and mediating, I guess, but what's really interfering with that large scale is the fact that we have institutions that are teaching certain values as true when there's simply no evidence for these things whatsoever. In fact, and often the evidence is against these things. And so I think that if you want to reclaim a good life, then I think it's, and this is, Aristotle talks about this quite a bit, if you want to reclaim a good life, then you have to have friendships. You have to have intimate friendships of virtue in which you're honest with people. And if you want to do that, first and foremost in that is you have to speak to people in such a way that may rub people the wrong way. So there's an element of danger in your speech. And I know when you're younger, it's very difficult to do that. But let me tell you something. Let me tell you two things. I love being 57. I can throw that around. Let me tell you two things. People will respect you more and not less if you're honest with them. The second thing is, in no uncertain terms, you will be able to figure out, I have lost a lot of friends, and it's been very difficult to me in my emotional life. There's no question about that. The quality of friendships I have now, I think, are pretty high. I think they're pretty good, and I would like to think that they're based on trust and virtue and openness and speaking honestly to people. But yeah, you will lose friends if you're honest with them. You will lose friends, but the quality of the friends you'll gain will be far greater because you've been honest with people. And when you can do that, then the influence of what you're being taught of the ideology, you'll be able to kind of truncate that a little bit. You'll be able to cut off the sharp edges on the top and the bottom. All right, well, that was my talk. Yes, hi.
I know you're talking about universities and colleges, but how far back are you seeing this go when it comes to our younger children?
Yeah, so I never thought I would say this. Of course, I never thought I would say half the things that I was saying 10 years ago, but I am now a fan of homeschooling. And that gets back to what I mentioned before, is that no matter how much you've published, no matter how long you've taught, you can't just walk into a K-12 system and teach. You have to get a teaching certificate, at least in this country. I can't speak for other countries. In the United States, I should have said that. But to get a teaching certificate, you have to go through teacher training and teacher education. And almost universally, those are predicated on the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, which I talked about. And so the model itself, I would argue, is fraught with ideological bias. So I've now become a big fan. I would have a hard time doing it myself, but fortunately my kids are grown. I'm a big fan of homeschooling. I think we need to remove, to the largest degree possible, our academic institutions from the lives of our young people.
So do away with the Department of Education.
Yeah, Vivek Ramaswamy wants to do that.
They all say they do.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's going to, I don't know, I'm not endorsing anybody, I'm just saying that idea has traction in the currency. But look, here's the other part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that you have people who have tenure, which is a job for life. And I published a piece about this in the Wall Street Journal a while ago. What people have done, if you look at certain institutions, the overwhelming number of faculty members, I can't speak to this institution specifically, they don't just lean, they're not just liberals, but they lean to the left or they lean to the far left. At my old institution, 99% of donations went to the Democratic Party. 1% of donations went to the Republican Party. There's no, look, if 99% of the people, forget that they were Mormons, there's no possible, you have to have some, it's Mill's, one of Mill's dictums, you have to have people who truly believe it. I used to teach atheism, and because I'm an atheist, I never taught the arguments to the existence of God, or almost never. I'd have people who actually believe them come in and they'd teach people. And there's something to that intellectual diversity that's helpful, but when you genuinely seek truth, you have to have ideological diversity in the classroom. And the consequence of not having it is that you become an ideology mill that replicates the dominant ideology. It's a natural consequence. It's inevitable. So real quick, idea laundering is this cool idea. My buddy Brett Weinstein used the term for this concept that I was telling him about. And basically the idea is, let's say that you like, onions on your, pineapple on your pizza. That's better, that's more offensive. And you like pineapple on your pizza, and you like pineapple on your pizza. And it just so happens that you're all three are academics, you're academicians. And you're like, oh yeah, let's make a journal, and we're gonna sell the journal about making pineapple on our pizza. And this guy's like, oh, that's a great idea. I love pineapple on pizza. And she's like, oh, screw, I hate Italy. We're going to put tons of pineapple on the pizza. So you're the journal editor, you're the journal editor. You're soliciting people. You're going to get the first solicitation. Then, this guy over here is like, oh, pineapple is the best thing I've ever had. So it's laundered, right? So usually I use pineapple because it's neutral, but well, not if you're Italian, but it was a joke. You have some moral impulse, it goes in the journal as a moral impulse, and you fabricate it as knowledge, right? It comes out the other side as knowledge. So the problem, for one of the reasons I think that the academy needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, is that we now have journals in place that are informing public policies that are not knowledge, they are the musings of ideologues. They are people who have gone for decades and decades and decades and just idea laundered everything. It's all idea laundered, all of it. And no offense, psychology is social studies. Gender studies is the worst. That's like the gold standard for bad. Because the whole point of like what I was saying with fat studies isn't to look at A1Cs or carbohydrate breakdowns, it's fat advocacy. And then that informs public policy. And by the way, the people most susceptible to that are young women. Did I see a hand? Yeah.
This might not have been the hand because I just put my hand up. So you started your talk by calling the people who published idiots, and you ended your talk.
No, not idiots. I said it was a uniquely idiotic age.
No, but the people who wrote the book, so White Fragility.
Oh, Robert D'Angelo, yes. Idiotic idea.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, you said idiotic idea.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So then you ended your talk talking about friendship. When you disagree with your friend, you should not be a dick about it, but you should let them know.
Correct. She's not my friend.
Sure, but when you talk about an institution with people of different ideologies coming together and working together,
Correct.
How do you think you could have that kind of institution where you don't have like respect of different ideologies? Because from what I heard from how you described this ideology of a different person, it didn't sound very respectful.
Yeah, no, it wasn't meant to be respectful. In fact, it was meant to be explicitly disrespectful. Here's why. We have to retain the ability to call out ideas. So if someone was forwarding Nazi race science, I would be absolutely disrespectful of that idea in the most profound way I possibly could. So we don't have an egalitarianism of ideas. Some ideas are bad and they need to be called out and literally harassed. We need to make the ideology, I mean, there are different ways to do it, but ridicule is a good way.
Like a bullhorn, would that work?
No, because the difference between the bullhorn is that the bullhorn doesn't allow the idea to be advocated in the first place. So I'm against any form of censorship. So I actually do believe, and I've told the University of Austin president this, I actually do believe we should have somebody who is a super woke person on the faculty. Like a super woke gender studies person who just wants to forward deranged ideologies. That's what our students need. The students need the most intellectual diversity possible, and they need to hear arguments from people who believe them. We need Trump supporters, we need Biden supporters, we need Vivek, we need everybody on the faculty.
Sorry, you were talking about Nazis earlier, but we shouldn't have Nazis on the
Well, that's
faculty.
the question. At what point is the line that we draw to say that, like Rufo would say that critical race theory is akin to kind of Nazism, might be extreme, but it's one moral place over from phrenology, right? So look, you can think about it like this. Should we have somebody on the faculty who's a phrenologist? Or should we have a creation scientist on the faculty? My answer to that would be no. However, and this is a huge caveat, I absolutely think that we should invite, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I absolutely think that we should invite people who are young earth creationists, people who are race realists, and have the most qualified people have debates with those individuals. But having them on the faculty is something different.
Coming up on about an hour and a half. So we do have a reception over here for anyone who wants to come over. And if you want to keep asking questions, I'm sure that you'll get some responses.
Good questions.
Yeah.
Really good
So
questions.
you join me in thanking Dr. Boghossian.